She walked into a mansion as a maid on her very first day and came face to face with a portrait of the man who vanished from her life 5 years ago. The same eyes, the same smile, the exact same smile she sees every morning on her 4-year-old daughter's face. She had spent 5 years raising his child alone, scraping through poverty, heartbreak, and silence. And now he was hanging on the wall of the most powerful crime family in Boston. This channel is your home for stories about mafia bosses who learn what truly matters, love that survives the darkest secrets, and families that find each other against every odd. One truth this story carries: the people we protect by leaving are sometimes destroyed by our absence. If that hit you somewhere deep, like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
Catherine Kensington did not raise her voice. She had no need to. Instead, her voice became quieter, slower, and incredibly precise. Each word was like a cold, heavy stone dropping onto a marble floor. "What did you just say?" Her gaze narrowed, becoming as sharp as a surgeon's knife, as she scanned Lena from her worn-out shoes all the way up to her pale face. There was no shock in her eyes. There was only the icy calculation of a woman who had spent 40 years as the wife of the most powerful mob boss on the East Coast. A woman who was familiar with every kind of threat imaginable. "I will ask you one more time," Catherine said, taking a single step closer to Lena. The scent of her expensive perfume drifted through the air, but there was nothing gentle about her stare. "What did you just say about my son?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat feeling as dry and rough as sandpaper. She understood that she had just opened a door that could never be closed again. The words she had spoken were still hanging in the room, heavy and undeniable. "Ma'am, I realize this must sound very—" Lena started, her voice trembling, but she fought to keep it from cracking. "Sound very what? Unbelievable? Audacious?" Catherine interrupted her, and now her voice held something far more menacing than just anger. It was a cold, restrained disgust. "You have been inside this house for less than 1 hour, and you have the nerve to stand before me and claim that my son, Jude Kensington, is the father of your child." She moved even closer. Lena desperately wanted to back away, but her legs refused to cooperate. "People who attempt to swindle my family rarely have a happy ending," Catherine said, her voice now as soft as velvet. But every single word was loaded with the finality of a judge's sentence. "I have seen countless people show up at this door with every sob story you can imagine, all of them hoping to get a piece of the Kensington fortune. If this is some kind of act, I strongly advise you to end it this very second, while I am still willing to use my words." Lena could feel the genuine danger hidden in that statement. This was not the idle threat of a wealthy woman annoyed by a disrespectful servant. This was the warning of someone who was accustomed to giving orders, to having them followed without question, and to making sure that anyone who defied her was simply removed from the equation. But Lena had survived for 27 years in a world that offered her no protection. She had slept in an old, abandoned car when she was 16. She had given birth all alone in a county hospital without a single person there to hold her hand. She was well acquainted with fear, and she knew the biggest fear was not the imposing woman standing before her, but the truth that was burning inside her, fighting to be heard. "I am not trying to blackmail you," Lena said. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes remained locked on Catherine's. "I had no idea who you were before I arrived this morning. I did not know whose house this was. The only thing I know is that the man in that painting is the man I fell in love with for 3 months, 5 years ago. He told me his name was Jack. He would come into the little diner where I worked every single morning and order a black coffee, no sugar. He would laugh whenever he told a terrible joke. He would run his hand through his hair when he felt awkward, and he would kiss me on the forehead every morning before he walked out the door." Lena's voice cracked on that last phrase, but she forced it down, determined not to cry in front of this woman. Then one morning, he was just gone. No explanation, no letter. The phone number he gave me was disconnected, as if our time together never even happened. She took a long, deep breath. 6 weeks after that, I discovered I was pregnant. I tried to find him everywhere, but all I had was a fake name and the memory of a man who, I now understand, was never who he pretended to be. Catherine remained perfectly still. Her expression did not change in the slightest. But Lena noticed a subtle shift deep in her eyes. It was not belief, not yet, but it was focus. The kind of focus you see when someone is truly listening, instead of just waiting for their turn to talk. My daughter's name is Phoebe, Lena continued, her voice gaining strength, as if saying her child's name was an anchor in the middle of a hurricane. She is 4 years and 3 months old. I have raised her completely on my own since the day she was born. No one helped me, no family, no friends, just me and my baby girl. I did not come to this house to find her father. I came here because the job pays 3 times what the diner did, and because my daughter deserves to have enough food to eat every single day. Lena paused, catching her breath. Seeing him in that painting was a complete accident. An accident I truly wish had never occurred. The room was plunged into silence again. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows and spread across the Persian rug, casting long stripes of light on the hardwood floor. The only sound was the steady ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick echoing in the tense space between the two women. Catherine stared at Lena for a very long time. It was no longer a look of assessment, but the look of someone mentally rearranging puzzle pieces, weighing what she had just heard against the things she already knew, trying to find a lie in the story, and failing. Finally, she turned, walked over to a deep blue velvet couch, and sat down. Her back was still perfectly straight, but her shoulders relaxed just a tiny bit. It was only a fraction of an inch, but it was enough for Lena to see that a small crack had formed in her perfect armor. "Sit down," Catherine said. Her voice was still chilly, but it no longer had the sharp edge of a knife. It had changed into something else. It was the voice of a seasoned detective who suddenly suspects that the person they are questioning might actually be telling the truth. "Start at the beginning. Give me every single detail. Do not leave a single thing out." And so, Lena told her the entire story. Every single detail. Rosie's Cafe in the South End, right on the corner by the train station, where the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the steam coming off the wet pavement in the mornings. Jack, who she now knew was Jude, would always show up at 7:30 in the morning, not a minute early, not a minute late, like he was programmed for that exact time. He always chose the same seat, a small table right by the window. He always had the same order, black coffee with absolutely no sugar. And he always looked at her with those gray-blue eyes when she carried his cup over. It was a look that made her hands shake so much during that first week that she almost spilled hot coffee all over the table. Catherine listened to every word without saying anything. She sat as still as a sculpture on the blue velvet couch, with only her eyes moving, scanning every single expression that crossed Lena's face, searching for the tiniest hint of a lie. When Lena had finished her story, the room was quiet once more. Catherine stood up, walked to a large oak cabinet by the window, opened the second drawer, and pulled out a brown, leather-bound photo album. It was not the kind of album you would leave out for guests. This one was personal, with worn leather corners and a slightly frayed spine. She set it down on the coffee table right in front of Lena without speaking. Lena glanced at the album, then back up at Catherine, unsure of what to do. "Open it," Catherine commanded, her voice sharp and direct. Lena turned to the first page, and she immediately gasped. This was not the formal, severe man from the oil painting on the wall. This was Jude as he really was. This was the Jude from everyday life. This was the Jack she had known. The first photograph was from a beach on Cape Cod. He was wearing a plain white t-shirt and shorts, smiling into the camera with his eyes squinted from the bright sun. The next one showed him in a bar, holding a glass of beer, his head tilted back slightly as he laughed at something someone off camera had just said. Then there was a birthday picture. He was standing over a cake, and the flickering candlelight was reflected in his gray-blue eyes. And there was that smile, tilting up a little bit to the left, looking almost shy, as if he was not used to being the focus of everyone's attention. Lena stopped at the beach photo, her finger gently brushing against the smooth plastic cover. That smile, it always tilts to the left, and the way he squints his eyes in instead of using sunglasses. She moved to the next page and paused on a photograph from a bar. It was the way he held his drink, always with his left hand, even though he was right-handed. And whenever he truly laughed, he would throw his head back, then smooth his hair down, almost like he was embarrassed by it. A tremor entered Lena's voice. My daughter does the exact same things. Phoebe runs her hand through her hair when she gets nervous. She tilts her head back when she laughs, and she is only 4 years old. She has these mannerisms she has never seen anyone else do, because the only other person who moves like her vanished before she was even born. Catherine remained silent as Lena flipped through the pages. But Lena saw the woman's hand, which had been resting peacefully in her lap, now clenching the fabric of her suit jacket. Her knuckles had turned completely white. It was the single detail that gave away Catherine Kensington's real feelings. Then she got to her feet, took her phone out of her pocket, and dialed a number from memory. Brennan. Her voice was pure ice again. I want a complete background check on someone. Lena Ashford, 27 years old. I want every last detail from 6 years ago until today. Where she has lived, where she has worked, her medical history, everything. I need the results by tonight, she commanded before ending the call. She faced Lena again, her expression completely blank, as if the past 15 minutes had been a simple business meeting. You will go back to your duties now, Catherine stated. Mrs. Patton is waiting for you in the east hallway. You will complete your shift like normal. Nobody, and I mean nobody, can know about this discussion. Not Mrs. Patton, not a single member of the staff, not anyone outside this room. Lena got up, her legs still feeling weak. She gave a small nod. Catherine moved in closer, so close that Lena could see the delicate veins on her hand, strained from being clenched for so long. And Lena, she said, using her first name for the first time. Not girl, not new girl, but Lena. And the way she said it held a significance Lena could not quite grasp. If that report shows that you are lying about even one small thing, you will deeply regret ever walking through those iron gates. The rest of the day was a blur, a haze Lena couldn't seem to break through. She trailed Mrs. Patton down the east hallway, half listening as the housekeeper went over the cleaning routine for every room, which polish to use on the oak floors, which on the marble, and how to fold the towels into the perfect fan shape that the Kensingtons required. Lena nodded. She memorized, and she repeated the instructions when asked. But her thoughts were somewhere else entirely, caught between the oil painting, Catherine's frozen expression, and the stormy blue eyes she saw every single day in her own daughter's face. Are you feeling okay? Mrs. Patton asked when Lena dropped a cleaning cloth for the third time in just 10 minutes. You seem a bit unfocused. I am so sorry, Lena replied, scooping it up while forcing a smile. It is just my first day. I am a little on edge. Mrs. Patton gave an understanding nod and did not ask any more questions. She was the type of person who sensed when not to pry, a quality Lena was very thankful for. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Patton took Lena up to the second floor, toward the master bedroom wing. This is Mr. Jude's room, she explained, swinging open a heavy oak door. He is currently in London, but Mrs. Kensington insists that it is kept spotless, as if he might come back at any time. When Lena walked in, she could feel a change in the atmosphere. The room was spacious, but felt surprisingly simple compared to the luxury of the rest of the house. There was a king-sized bed with a dark wooden headboard, a pair of nightstands with only a lamp on each, and a mahogany desk near the window that looked out over the gardens. The only things on it were a closed laptop and a picture frame that was placed face down. This was the room of someone who did not want to be remembered, or perhaps someone who was trying to forget. Mrs. Patton told her to change the bedding and dust all the surfaces, then left to check on another part of the house, instructing Lena to finish her work and lock the door behind her. Once she was alone, Lena moved around the room carefully, as if she were walking through a field of hidden dangers. Her hands were shaking as she pulled the sheets off the bed, and when a familiar scent rose from the pillow, she had to pause, clutching the fabric with her eyes shut. Wood and bergamot. It was Jack's scent, the one she had smelled every night while lying next to him in their tiny Dorchester apartment. The same scent she had desperately tried to find on her own pillows for months after he disappeared, until it was gone for good, and she had to finally accept that he was never coming back. And now, here it was, perfectly preserved, as if 5 years had never gone by. Lena made herself get back to work, change the sheets, dust the furniture, tidy up. When she got to the desk, she carefully wiped around the laptop and then the picture frame, pretending to clean behind it. She picked up the frame. The photo was of Jude, with his parents at what looked like a graduation. Someone was handing him a diploma. Catherine stood to his right, wearing an uncharacteristically warm smile, and on his left was a tall man with a stern face, who Lena guessed was Raymond Kensington. But it was not the picture that made her heart stop. It was what had been tucked away behind it. A small, round piece of cardboard with worn edges in a light brown color. She knew what it was before she even flipped it over, because she had handled thousands just like it during her 5 years as a waitress. It was a cardboard coaster, the kind they put under every coffee cup at Rosie's Cafe. The Rosie's Cafe logo was almost completely faded, but you could still make out the unique rose design and the tiny letters underneath. Lena turned the coaster over with hands that were trembling so much she almost dropped it. On the back was slanted handwriting in blue ink. Lena. It was her own writing. She remembered it happening like it was yesterday. It was the first day Jack had ever come into the cafe. She had scribbled her name on the coaster when he asked for it, because the diner was packed and she had to run to her other tables. He had saved it. From that very first day, for 5 whole years, he had brought it from Boston to London and kept it hidden behind a picture on his desk, in a room he demanded be kept perfect, as if he might walk back in at any second. Lena put the frame back exactly where she found it, with the coaster now resting in her palm. It felt like it weighed nothing, but it was also the heaviest thing she had ever held. She stood there in Jude Kensington's room, breathing in the scent of wood and bergamot, holding a coaster with her name on it. And for the first time in 5 years, she let herself consider a thought she had pushed down deep inside. Maybe he did not want to leave. Maybe he was forced to. As the day ended, and the setting sun painted the mansion's tall windows in shades of deep red, Lena was called to Catherine's study. This room was different from the main living area, smaller and more intimate, with a massive wooden desk and bookshelves that reached all the way to the ceiling. Catherine was seated behind the desk. On the polished wood in front of her was a slim brown file, the type Lena knew you could not get from any government office. She did not offer Lena a seat. She did not have to. Lena understood this was not going to be a friendly chat. Lena Ashford. Catherine began to read, her voice flat and without any hint of emotion. Placed in the foster care system at age 3, moved between 4 different foster homes over 13 years, left the system at 16, worked as a waitress at Rosie's Cafe in South Boston from age 21 to 22, left her job because of a pregnancy. Her daughter, Phoebe Ashford, was born at Boston Medical Center. She currently lives in apartment 312 at the Maple Building in Dorchester. Her yearly income is below the federal poverty line. She snapped the file shut. Everything you said is true. Lena remained silent. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulled out the coaster, and set it on the desk next to the file. Catherine glanced down, recognized the Rosie's cafe symbol, flipped it over, and saw the name Lena written in blue ink. For the very first time since Lena had walked into her home, Catherine Kensington's composure cracked. It was only for a moment, a blink that lasted a fraction too long, a slightly deeper inhale, a swallow she tried to hide. But Lena saw it. "I discovered this in your son's room," Lena said quietly, tucked behind a picture frame. "It is my name, in my own handwriting. He has held on to it for 5 years." Catherine did not pick up the coaster. She just stared at it, as if it was the last piece of a puzzle she had been refusing to solve for half a decade. Then she leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window, where the Boston sky was shifting from red to a deep shade of purple. "5 years ago," Catherine started, her voice now completely changed. It was no longer cold and sharp, but low and filled with a heaviness, like someone opening a chest that had been sealed for far too long. Jude barricaded himself in his room for 3 days. He would not eat, he would not talk, he would not open the door for anyone, not even for me. She looked back at Lena. When he finally emerged, he spoke only a single sentence. "I have no reason to stay here anymore." After that, he agreed to manage the London office, a job he had turned down for 2 solid years. He was on a plane that same week, and he has not come back since. Catherine laid her hand on the coaster, her fingertips gently tracing the name Lena, just as her son, thousands of miles away in London, likely did every night before he went to sleep. "I asked Raymond, my husband, if he had any idea what had happened with Jude. He told me no. I trusted him." She took a breath. "I now believe he was lying to me." Looking straight into Lena's eyes, Catherine spoke with a tone that was both a command and a desperate request. "Bring the child to me tomorrow. If she has Kensington blood in her, I will know it." The bus ride back to Dorchester felt like it took forever. Lena sat in the very back, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the lights of Boston streak by without really seeing them. The streetlights began to pop on, their soft yellow glow blurring through her tired eyes like stars falling backward from the sky. Apron pocket. Her phone was a lifeline in her hand, the only thing that made the day feel real and not some terrible dream. When the bus hissed to a stop at her corner, Lena stepped onto the pavement, taking in the familiar evening air of her neighborhood. The scent of fried chicken wafted from a local restaurant. Loud music poured from an open window 5 floors up. On the small playground down the street, children's happy screams filled the air. She walked through the rusty gate of her apartment building, climbing 3 long flights of stairs. The lights in the hallway flickered, on the verge of burning out. She passed the spot on the second floor where the wall was peeling, a problem she had reported back in March that was still ignored. But the moment she unlocked the door to apartment 312, the chaos of the world outside disappeared. The space was small and crowded, but it was filled with the life of 2 people. The refrigerator was a gallery of Phoebe's art. Houses were painted in wild colors, flowers grew taller than people, and winged cats soared across purple skies. A tiny mint plant sat on the windowsill, the single survivor of the winter because Phoebe remembered to give it water each morning. The colorful quilt Dolly had made was thrown over the worn-out sofa, with every square telling a story the old woman shared during her babysitting nights. "Mama!" Phoebe shot out of the living room with the force of a tiny cannonball. Her light brown hair was a mess, her fierce eyes were bright, and she clutched Biscuit, her beloved stuffed bear, which was missing an eye and worn from years of love. Lena immediately knelt and pulled her daughter into a hug, holding on so fiercely that Phoebe squeaked, "Mama, I cannot breathe." Still, Lena did not loosen her grip. She breathed in the smell of baby shampoo from her daughter's hair and felt the small arms wrap around her neck. For the very first time all day, Lena felt like she was standing on solid ground. Dolly appeared in the doorway, her knitting needles clicking, and she watched them with a kind smile. She was a good girl today. We worked on counting to 100 in Spanish. "Thank you, Miss Dolly," Lena said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "You seem worn out," Dolly noted, peering over the top of her glasses. That first day with the wealthy folks must have been tough. Tougher than I imagined, Lena admitted. It was likely the most honest statement she had made all day. After Dolly went home, Lena started on dinner, making scrambled eggs with toast. Phoebe called it breakfast for dinner, and the idea of it being backward always made her laugh. Lena sat at the tiny table pushed up against the wall, watching her daughter eat. Suddenly, she was noticing everything. Phoebe would tilt her head while she chewed, just like Jude did in that birthday picture. She held her milk glass with her left hand, even though she was right-handed, the same way Jack held his beer in the photo album. And then there was the dimple, the little indent that appeared when she laughed. Lena had always assumed it came from a forgotten relative, but now it had a name, a face, and a portrait that hung in a grand mansion on Beacon Hill. Later that night, Phoebe was asleep in their shared bed, curled up with Biscuit under her chin. Her mouth was slightly parted, her breathing soft and steady. Lena was lying next to her, wide awake. She took out her phone, turned the screen to its lowest brightness, and went to her photo collection. She swiped backward in time, going past countless pictures of Phoebe from her birth to today. She passed tired selfies taken after long night shifts and photos of ramen noodles eaten at 2 in the morning while Phoebe was learning to roll over. Finally, she found them. There were 4 pictures, the only things left from the 3 happiest months of her life. The first was a selfie they took in the Boston Common during the fall. Jack's arm was wrapped around her, and they were both smiling, with brilliant red maple trees in the background. The second showed Jack in the kitchen of her very own apartment, the same place she had just cooked eggs. He was wearing a striped apron with tomato sauce on his cheek, giving a sheepish grin after he had burned a pot of noodles. The third picture was blurry because Lena had taken it quickly. It showed Jack kissing her on the forehead in the rain, with water droplets sparkling in his hair, and his gray-blue eyes closed. The fourth one was the last picture she ever took of him. Jack was asleep on her sofa with one arm behind his head, his face looking so very peaceful. Lena remembered thinking in that moment that she wanted to see that face beside her every morning for the rest of her days. 2 days after she took that photo, he was gone. Lena switched off her phone and just stared at the ceiling. The crack was still there, a jagged line running from the corner to the middle of the room. It looked the same as it did almost 5 years ago, when she was 7 months pregnant and all alone, unsure of what she would name her baby, and terrified about how she would make the next month's rent. She recalled the nights she woke up at 3 in the morning to feed Phoebe, her eyes so heavy with sleep, but too scared to close them in case her baby choked. She remembered when Phoebe was 8 months old, and she had to go back to work while still nursing, leaving her baby with Dolly all day. She would come home, hold her daughter, and cry silent tears as guilt consumed her. She remembered the night Phoebe had a fever of 104 degrees when she was 8 months old. Lena had run 6 blocks with no shoes on through the freezing streets to the emergency room because she did not have enough money for a cab, singing soft lullabies as her own tears soaked through her shirt. She had not cried since that night. It was not because she had no more tears to shed, but because she learned that tears could not buy milk, they could not pay the rent, and they could not heal a sick child. She could not afford to be weak. Her daughter needed her to be strong. And now, in the morning, she had to take her 4-year-old child to a mansion she could never have dreamed of, to meet a grandmother she did not know existed, all to prove that the blood running through her veins connected her to a world that was 1,000,000 miles away from apartment 312 in the Maple Building. The next morning, Lena woke up early. She dressed Phoebe in her nicest floral dress and carefully combed her hair, even though Phoebe complained. "Today, we are going to meet a lady at the place where Mama works," Lena explained, trying her best to sound completely casual. Phoebe looked at her, her gray-blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Does she have any cookies?" Lena led Phoebe to the back of the mansion, avoiding the grand front entrance just as Catherine had told her to do the day before. The stone path wound its way through a garden where the final hydrangea blossoms of the season held on to a pale purple color just before the cold Boston winter arrived. Phoebe walked close to her mother, holding Lena's hand with one of hers and Biscuit with the other. Her curious eyes took in every detail with the kind of wonder only a child has. "Mama, this house is really big," she said in a hushed voice, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Do people live in all of the rooms?" "Yes, sweetheart, they do," Lena replied, her grip on her daughter's hand tightening. The guest house was located at the back of the garden. It was a two-story building that was smaller than the main house, but was still 3 times bigger than their apartment in Dorchester. Catherine Kensington was already there, waiting for them on the porch. She was dressed in an elegant cream-colored suit, with her platinum hair pulled back so perfectly that not a single hair was out of place. Her posture was as straight as a ruler, but she was not looking at Lena. Her gaze was locked on Phoebe from the moment they came into view, and she watched the little girl with an intensity that Lena could feel from 20 feet away. Phoebe could feel it as well. She stopped walking, pulled on her mother's hand, and hid behind Lena's leg, squeezing her worn teddy bear even tighter. "Mama," she whispered, blinking her gray-blue eyes. "She is looking at me funny." Lena gently placed a hand on her daughter's head and smoothed down her light brown hair. "It is okay, sweetie. She is just excited to meet you." Catherine must have heard Phoebe's quiet voice. Lena watched the older woman take a deep breath before she stepped off the porch. She approached them slowly, with deliberate steps, as if she worried that any sudden movement would startle the child. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped. She lowered herself slightly, not quite kneeling, because a woman like Catherine Kensington did not kneel for anyone, but just enough to be at Phoebe's eye level. "Hello?" she said, her voice much softer than Lena had ever heard. It was so gentle that it was hard to believe it belonged to the same woman who had made threats in the living room just one day earlier. "You must be Phoebe, is that right?" Phoebe gave a small nod, still mostly concealed behind her mother. But her curiosity got the better of her, peeked out from behind Lena's leg. "Do you have any cookies?" Catherine blinked, and then a smile spread across her face, a smile Lena was sure very few people had ever witnessed. "I do," she replied. "I have plenty of cookies. Come on inside, and I will show you." The guest house living room was much warmer than Lena had anticipated. There was a sofa with floral upholstery and white lace curtains. On the coffee table in the middle of the room sat a tray of warm, golden cookies next to a pitcher of apple juice and 3 glasses, 2 large and 1 small. Catherine had prepared everything so carefully, and that spoke volumes more than words ever could. The moment Phoebe saw the cookies, all her shyness disappeared. She shot a look at her mother, asking for permission. Lena gave a slight nod, and Phoebe climbed onto the edge of the sofa, picking out a single cookie and taking a tiny bite. Her eyes widened in delight. "It is good," she announced with a huge grin. A dimple appeared on her plump cheek, deep and impossible to miss, a perfect match, down to the tiniest detail, to the one in the birthday picture of Jude that Lena had been looking at in the photo album just the day before. Catherine brought a hand to her chest, her fingers clutching the material of her suit jacket right over her heart, and Lena saw her knuckles go white. "Jude loved these when he was a little boy," Catherine said, her voice shaking. It was truly the first time Lena had ever heard it tremble. The words "when he was a little boy" fell from her lips, weighed down by 40 years of memories. Mrs. Cook used to bake them every single Sunday. He would always grab the most and hide them in his coat pocket to take upstairs. Phoebe did not grasp the history behind those words, but she felt the kindness in the older woman's voice. So, she held up her half-eaten cookie as an offering. "Do you want a bite? It is really good." Catherine gently shook her head, but the smile never left her face. Her eyes were misty with tears, and she made no effort to hide them. Or maybe she just could not. After Phoebe ate her second cookie, she became bolder and started exploring the living room. She touched the sofa's fabric, looked at the vase on the windowsill, and then she remembered the little backpack she had brought with her. Mama, can I show her my coloring book? Lena nodded, her heart starting to pound. She knew exactly what was in that book. Phoebe opened her backpack and took out a worn sketchbook with a cover full of star and cat stickers. She climbed onto the sofa next to Catherine, moving so naturally it surprised both women, and opened the book. The pages were filled with a child's crayon drawings. There was a house with smoke curling out of the chimney, flowers that were almost as big as the page itself, and a smiling sun. Catherine looked at every page, nodding and offering soft praise, until Phoebe got to one specific drawing and stopped. "This one is my favorite," she said with the seriousness only a 4-year-old can have. The drawing showed 3 people holding hands. The smallest one was in the middle, with brown hair and a floral dress, which was clearly Phoebe. To the left stood a taller person with long hair, Mama. On the right was the tallest figure, drawn more simply, with short hair, standing a little apart from the other two, as if the artist was not quite sure where to place him. "This is Mama. This is me. And this," Phoebe said, pointing to the figure on the right, "is Daddy." Catherine stared at the picture, then looked back at Phoebe. "Is your daddy very far away?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. Phoebe nodded with a somber look. "Very far. But Mama says Daddy loves me. He just had to go somewhere really far away." Catherine's eyes met Lena's. Her gaze was completely different now. The coldness, the harshness, the suspicion and contempt Lena had seen yesterday were all gone. In their place was something much more complicated, something that took Lena a moment to figure out. It was respect, because Lena had taught her daughter that her father loved her instead of teaching the child to hate him. It was pain, because she was looking at a 4-year-old granddaughter she should have known since the day she was born. And it was shame, a deep and profound shame that only a guilty conscience can produce, because she was starting to realize her family had stolen something from this little girl that no amount of cookies or mansions could ever give back. Just then, the ringing of a phone shattered the silence. Catherine pulled it from her pocket, looked at the screen, and her entire expression changed in an instant. She stood up, murmured, "Excuse me," and stepped outside onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. Lena could hear the sound of her voice through the glass, quiet but sharp. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Fine. No, do not ask questions. Just get back here." When Catherine came back inside, her face was composed again, but a new kind of stress tightened the corners of her eyes. "There has been a change of plans," she said, her eyes fixed on Lena. "Jude changed his flight. He is arriving tomorrow morning." Lena felt like the ground was shifting under her. Tomorrow morning. Not over the weekend. Not next week. Tomorrow. "I am not ready," she said, the words spilling out before she could catch them, more honest than anything she had said in the last 2 days. Catherine looked at her for a long moment. Then her gaze shifted to Phoebe, who was now busy adding a new yellow flower to her family portrait with a crayon, completely unaware that her entire world was about to be turned upside down. "No one is ever ready for this," Catherine said, her voice low. It was not cold, but it was heavy. Heavy with the weight of a decision she had to carry. "But my son has already lost 5 years. He should not lose a single day more." More than 5,000 miles away, in a 6th-floor suite at Claridge's in central London, Jude Kensington sat by a window, gazing down at Mayfair at midnight. A light drizzle coated the window pane. Tiny drops of water made their way down the glass in shifting paths, like roads he had decided not to take. The whiskey glass on the marble windowsill was long empty, with only a faint amber ring at the bottom and the lingering smell of peat smoke in the room. Next to it, on the cold stone, was a small, round piece of cardboard with frayed edges. It was pale brown and so old it was almost falling apart, a coaster from Rosie's cafe. Jude picked it up and turned it over, looking at the slanted handwriting in blue ink. It was a little faded by time, but you could still read it. Lena. He gently ran his thumb over the name, as if he was afraid that pressing any harder would make it vanish. Just like the woman with that name had vanished from his life. No, not vanished. The way he had cut her out of his own life and told himself it was for her protection. The door opened. Brennan walked in without knocking. It was a right he had earned after 10 years by Jude's side, through secret negotiations in dark rooms, through sleepless nights, and through making choices most men would never have to face. He saw the coaster in Jude's hand and did not seem surprised, because it was not the first time he had seen it, not the 10th, and not the 100th. "Boss, your mother called," Brennan said in a steady voice. "She wants you on an earlier flight tomorrow morning." Jude did not even look up. Did she say why? She did not. Just that it is important, and that she needs you home right away. Jude stayed quiet, his gaze locked on the coaster. Brennan stood with his arms crossed, watching his boss with the kind of patience that comes from seeing too much. Then he let out a soft, barely audible sigh. "It has been 5 years, boss," Brennan said. His tone was not an accusation. It was just tired. The kind of tired you get from saying the same thing over and over, and knowing the answer is not going to change. "You should just let it go." Jude finally raised his head. His gray-blue eyes, the very same eyes that a 4-year-old girl on the other side of the world had, though he did not know it, met Brennan's with a look of quiet sadness. "I have let go of everything else in my life, Brennan," he said, his voice quiet and slow. "I let go of my dream to be an architect when my father told me to take a seat at the director's table. I let go of the right to choose my own path the day I was born with the Kensington name. I even let go of the only woman who ever looked at me and did not see dollar signs or power or something to be afraid of." His eyes went back to the coaster. "Except for this. This is the one thing I cannot let go of." Brennan did not say anything else. He had learned a long time ago that some fights were not worth fighting, and the coaster with Lena's name on it was one of them. Jude stood up and slipped the coaster into the inside pocket of his jacket, on the left side, right over his heart. It was the exact same place it had been for 5 years, through every single board meeting, every stuffy dinner, and every long night spent in the empty silence of his London suite. "Book the flight for tomorrow morning," Jude said, walking past Brennan toward the closet to start packing. Brennan nodded and pulled out his phone. But before he turned away, he glanced back one last time at the man he worked for. A powerful mafia boss on the East Coast was folding shirts into a suitcase. These were the same hands that, just 12 hours before, had signed off on a $200 million deal. He wondered if fate was playing a cruel joke or setting something bigger into motion. Catherine Kensington had suddenly called her son home on the very night he found himself staring at a worn piece of cardboard from his past. Jude had no idea what was coming. He did not know that across town in Boston, a woman was also wide awake in a small Dorchester apartment, looking at old photographs and counting down the hours. And he certainly did not know that in 12 hours, the past he had fought to bury for 5 years would be standing in his family's living room. It would have the same gray-blue eyes as his, but on the face of a 4-year-old child he never knew existed. That morning, Lena chose not to wear her uniform. She stood in front of the small bathroom mirror in her Dorchester apartment, studying her reflection under the flickering fluorescent light. She then put away the neatly folded housekeeper's uniform she had laid out. Instead, she picked the simple, black dress from her closet. It was the only piece of clothing she owned that was not for work, something she had bought on sale at a thrift store 2 years earlier for a job interview she did not get. The dress was old, but it fit her perfectly. The soft cotton hugged her body, looking formal enough to give her confidence, yet simple enough that she still felt like herself. She let her hair down instead of pulling it back like she did every single day. After one last look in the mirror, she turned away. If she was going to face Jude Kensington, she would do it as Lena Ashford, not as his family's housekeeper. The morning bus dropped her off in Beacon Hill at 7:45. The moment she walked through the mansion's iron gates, she could feel that something was different. A sleek black Audi was parked right in front of the main entrance. That car had not been there 2 days ago. He was home. Her heart began to pound so hard she could feel the beat in her throat. She walked directly to the main door instead of using the staff entrance. Mrs. Patton answered, her eyes briefly flicking over Lena's black dress instead of her uniform. But she said nothing, only nodding her head and stepping aside as if she had been told that this morning would be far from normal. Lena walked across the marble foyer, the quiet clicks of her low heels echoing through the hall. She moved down the corridor she had already memorized in just 2 days, passing by oil paintings and crystal chandeliers. She finally stopped in front of the large double oak doors of the main living room. From inside she could hear a man's voice, deep and calm. Her entire body went rigid, a shock as cold as ice water running down her back. It had been 5 years since she had heard that voice. For 5 years, she had convinced herself she had forgotten it. She was wrong. Lena knocked. "Come in," Catherine's voice called out. It was steady, but tight with tension, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Lena pushed the door open. Catherine was sitting in her usual armchair to the left of the fireplace. Her back was straight and her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. To the right of the fireplace stood a tall man in a gray suit with his back to the door. He held a coffee cup in one hand while the other was tucked into his pocket. He was saying something to his mother. His voice was warm and even, the voice of a man who had just come home after a long trip, completely unaware that the entire house had changed while he was gone. Then he turned, and for a moment, time stood still. It was those eyes, that unmistakable haunting look she had never been able to forget. 5 years had etched sharper lines onto his face, making him look harder, more weary. There were a few hints of silver at his temples, and his jaw was tighter, like a man who grinds his teeth at night. But his eyes had not changed at all. They were the same eyes she had looked into every morning for 3 months, the same eyes she had seen every day since on her daughter's face. The coffee cup in Jude's hand tipped sideways, almost crashing to the floor. He managed to catch it just in time, but dark drops of hot liquid spilled onto his skin. He did not even seem to notice the burn. His whole body became stiff. Only his eyes moved, widening and blinking fast, as if his brain was refusing to accept what he was seeing. Lena. Her name escaped his lips as a hoarse whisper, more like a rush of air forced from a constricted throat than an actual word. Speaking her name seemed to have sucked all the oxygen right out of his lungs. Lena just stood there, her arms straight at her sides, her back erect, her gaze locked on him. She had spent the entire night preparing for this, rehearsing exactly what she would say. But now, seeing him in person, every single practiced word disappeared from her mind. All that was left was the truth. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice much calmer than she felt. Or, I guess I should say, Jude Kensington, the mafia boss whose real name I never even knew. Jude placed the coffee cup on the mantel. His hand was shaking so badly that it clinked against the marble. He looked over at his mother, pure panic flashing across the face of the most powerful man on the East Coast. In that single moment, he looked just like a little boy who had been caught misbehaving. "Mother," he said, his voice cracking, "what is going on here?" Catherine did not get up. She did not even move or change her expression. She just looked at her son with the eyes of a woman who had been getting ready for this moment for 2 straight days. And then she spoke, her voice so calm it was almost cruel. She sounded as if she were simply reading the weather forecast, as if her next words did not have the power to destroy everything in that room. "You have a daughter, Jude. She is 4 years old. Her name is Phoebe." A deep silence filled the room. It was not an awkward silence or a thoughtful one. It was the kind of silence you find in the split second after a bomb is dropped, but before it hits the ground and shatters everything. That frozen moment when everything is still whole, yet everyone knows that nothing will ever be the same again. Jude looked from his mother to Lena and then back to his mother again. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His right hand fumbled behind him until it found the back of a nearby armchair. He gripped it tightly, his fingers turning white. The color drained from his face so completely that Lena could see the faint blue veins on his temple. And those gray-blue eyes, which just 12 hours ago had stared out at the city with a familiar loneliness, were now wide with something far greater than surprise. It was pure primal shock, the kind that makes the body forget how to work. Daughter, Jude repeated, the word falling from his lips like a heavy stone. 4 years. Catherine gave a single firm nod. The woman standing before you is the child's mother. She came to work here. She recognized your picture on the wall. I have spent the last 2 days confirming every detail. Her story checks out. Jude's eyes shot back to Lena, searching her face for some kind of denial. Any sign that this was all just a terrible mistake. Lena offered him no such comfort. She stood tall, her arms at her sides, and began to speak. Her voice was clear and cool. There were no tears, no shaking, no begging for sympathy. 6 weeks after you vanished, I discovered I was pregnant, she stated. I tried to find you. The phone number you gave me was disconnected. Nobody at the cafe knew who you were. All I had was a fake name and some memories. I gave birth by myself at Boston Medical Center. There was no one there to hold my hand in the delivery room. She paused, not for emotion, but just to catch her breath. I have raised Phoebe on my own from her very first day. I worked 2 jobs every day. There were some months when I could not afford formula, so I just skipped my own meals to make sure she had enough to eat. When Phoebe was 8 months old, she had a 104-degree fever in the middle of the night. I ran 6 blocks barefoot to the emergency room because I did not have enough money in my wallet for a taxi. Every sentence was a razor's edge, and Lena knew it. But her goal was not to injure him. She was only telling him the truth, and the truth was brutal enough on its own. I did not come here trying to find you, she stated plainly. I had no idea who you were until I saw that portrait. I came for this job because it pays 3 times what the cafe did, and my daughter has to eat. It is that simple. At some point, Jude had collapsed into an armchair, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands gripping his head. His back was hunched over, and his shoulders shook slightly. When he finally looked up, his gray-blue eyes were red-rimmed and watery, not quite crying but holding back a flood of tears. I did not know, he said, his voice completely broken. Lena, I promise you, I did not know. If I had known. What difference would it have made? Lena asked, her tone not bitter, but genuinely curious. Jude looked at her, then stared down at his own hands, as if the answer was written there on his palms. Then he began to speak. My father found out about us, he said, his voice dropping lower, becoming heavier, like a man opening a tomb that had been sealed for 5 years. Raymond Kensington does not like surprises. He had you followed. He was aware of everything. Where you lived, where you worked, what time you left, and what time you came home. Then he summoned me to his office. Jude had to swallow hard. He ordered me to end our relationship right away. I told him no. The very next day, you were let go from Rosie's. Lena physically recoiled. She recalled that morning perfectly, the owner asking her into the back kitchen, refusing to look her in the eye while he mentioned staff reductions. His voice had been shaky, and she had taken him at his word, believing she was just another unlucky person on a layoff list. My father purchased the entire building that the cafe leased, Jude went on, forcing each word out through gritted teeth, just to get you fired. And then he told me, this is just the first step. If you refuse to listen, the next step will not be so gentle. I know my father, Lena. He does not make empty threats. He possesses the influence, the resources, and the cruelty to follow through on them. His voice cracked entirely on the next words. I left because I was terrified he would hurt you. I believed that if I vanished, he would leave you in peace. I thought it was the only way I could keep you safe. Catherine then spoke, her voice low and somber. Raymond is from a different generation, she said, her gaze drifting toward the window where the morning sun poured through the tall panes of glass. To him, bloodline is everything. Social standing is everything. I am not making excuses for my husband. I just want you to see that Jude's choice was not made under normal circumstances. Lena took it all in. She listened to every word, absorbing each new piece of information. And inside her, two feelings flowed together like rivers that could never truly mix. One was pure rage, a rage she had held on to for 5 years, rage for the man who had disappeared and left her to fend for herself. The other was understanding, the gut-wrenching realization that he had not left because he fell out of love with her, but because he loved her too much and was too scared. And that realization was more painful than the anger ever was. "You took away my right to choose," Lena said. And now her own voice was shaking, truly shaking, because the anger and the understanding were ripping her apart. "You decided for me that I needed to be protected by being abandoned. You believed you were being noble by sacrificing yourself. But do you have any idea what that sacrifice did to me? To your daughter?" Jude did not reply. He just stared at her, his gray-blue eyes drowning in regret. This was not the shallow regret of a man who had been caught. It was the kind that eats you alive from the inside, the kind that had been his constant companion every day and every night in that London suite, right next to the coaster with her name on it. "Phoebe," he said, and her name seemed to break in half as it left his lips. "Can I see her?" Lena watched him for a long moment. She studied those watery gray-blue eyes, the same ones that looked back at her every morning from her daughter's face when she asked what was for breakfast. She studied the trembling hands of the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast. She studied the man who had shattered her heart but had also given her the most wonderful gift of her life. "Yes," Lena said. "But if you disappear on us again, Jude Kensington, I do not care who you are or how powerful you think you are. I promise you will not get a third chance." Jude drove with his eyes glued to the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. Lena sat beside him in the passenger seat, her hands resting calmly in her lap as she looked out the window. Neither of them said a word. Austin slid past them, from the brick-lined streets of Beacon Hill to the broad avenues of downtown, before shifting into neighborhoods that were older, grittier, and more real. 10 minutes went by filled with nothing but the low hum of the car's engine and the sound of distant horns. 10 minutes where every single second felt heavy, as each of them battled their own internal storm. Lena was the first to break the silence, not because she wanted to, but because the quiet was becoming unbearable. "She likes to draw," she said quietly, her eyes still fixed on the view outside. "Just like you." Jude risked a quick glance at her, the first since they had left the house. "Like me?" "You would not know," Lena answered. "But Phoebe draws pictures of houses all day long. All different kinds. Houses that have gardens, houses with smoke coming from the chimneys, houses with balconies covered in flowers. She draws houses so much. Her preschool teacher asked me one time if her mother was an architect." She took a breath. "She draws houses as if she is looking for a place to belong, but she has not found it yet." Jude did not say anything. He turned his attention back to the road, but Lena could see his jaw clench, a muscle twitching just under his skin. When the Audi turned onto Maple Street, he eased his foot off the gas. He looked through the windshield at the apartment building, at the rusted iron gate, the cracked concrete stairs, and the stained exterior wall covered in graffiti. He saw laundry lines stretched between the balconies on the 4th floor. This was the place where his daughter lived. This was the place where, while he was sitting in a luxury suite at Claridge's looking down at Mayfair, Phoebe was sleeping in a tiny apartment, sharing a bed with her mother and holding a well-loved stuffed bear named Biscuit. "I do not feel pity," Jude said softly as he shut off the engine, his eyes still locked on the building. "I feel ashamed." Lena did not respond. She just opened her car door and got out. Jude followed her. They walked up 3 flights of stairs in silence, passing flickering lights in the hallway, walls with peeling plaster, and the smell of fried food coming from an apartment on the second floor. Jude did not complain or even flinch. He just watched, his eyes taking in every single detail, adding up every single thing his daughter had gone without for 4 years because of a choice he had made. Lena knocked on Dolly's apartment door. It swung open, and before Lena could say anything, a small, brown-haired blur shot out toward her. "Mama!" Phoebe threw her arms around her mother's leg, her face turned up, her gray-blue eyes sparkling. And then she noticed Jude. She stopped moving and tilted her head to one side, in the exact same way Jude did when he was figuring out a situation, the exact same way she had when she looked at Catherine. Her curious eyes traveled from his polished leather shoes all the way up to his face and stopped when they met his eyes. 2 identical sets of eyes met, like a mirror reflecting 2 completely different worlds. Then Phoebe ducked behind her mother's leg, gripping her one-eyed bear even tighter. "Mama," she whispered, "I do not like strangers." Lena placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's head. "It is all right, sweetheart." She looked over at Jude, and he understood immediately. He took one step back, and then another, giving the little girl her space. He did not try to get closer, did not kneel down to try and force a conversation. He did not do any of the things an impatient adult might do. He just stood there quietly and waited. Inside Dolly's living room, a small drawing table was set up in a corner. Phoebe went back to her usual spot, got out her crayons, and started to draw, completely ignoring Jude as though he was not even there. Jude glanced at Lena. She gave him the tiniest shake of her head, a clear signal not to push things. He nodded in understanding, and then he did something Lena never would have anticipated. He pulled a small chair over, sat down at the table next to Phoebe, picked up a clean sheet of paper and a few crayons, and started to draw. He did not say a word, did not even look at her. He just drew. He sketched a house with clean lines and perfect proportions, a porch with columns, large windows, and steps leading up to the front door. He just sat there, a powerful mafia boss perched on a tiny plastic chair in a Dorchester apartment, drawing the most incredible house that crayons could possibly create. Phoebe peeked at him from the corner of her eye. She tried to act like he was not there, but a 4-year-old's curiosity is stronger than caution. She kept looking over at him again and again. Finally, she stopped pretending and just stared openly. "Whose house are you drawing?" she asked, her voice still cautious but filled with interest. Jude looked up at her gently. "I do not know yet. I just enjoy drawing houses." "I like drawing houses too," Phoebe said. And with that, the first bridge between a father and his daughter was built, as light as a whisper, but carrying more significance than any business deal Jude had ever closed. She scooted her chair a little closer to him, and then a little closer still. She opened her sketchbook, turned to a page, and laid it on the table between them. It was a drawing of 3 people holding hands. Mama, Phoebe, and a third person standing a little bit away from them, drawn with rough lines and short hair. "Who is this?" Jude asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That is my daddy," Phoebe replied with great seriousness. "Mama says, Daddy went very far away. But I still draw my daddy." Jude had to turn his head away. His shoulders were shaking now, clearly visible. And Lena, watching from across the room, saw him raise a hand to his eyes quickly, as if he were wiping away sweat. But it was not sweat. The most ruthless mafia boss on the East Coast was crying over a picture drawn with crayons by a 4-year-old child. Then Phoebe added softly, with the kind of direct honesty that only children have, "Tommy has a daddy. Maya has a daddy. Everybody has a daddy." She looked down at her drawing. "I do not." A heavy silence filled the room, so thick it felt hard to breathe. And then Phoebe did something that no one saw coming. She carefully tore the drawing out of her sketchbook, smoothed it out flat on the table, and held it out to Jude with both of her small hands. "For you," she said with a serious look, "because you look sad." Jude accepted the paper with both of his hands. These were hands that had signed million-dollar contracts, that had held steady through life-or-death negotiations, that carried the power of an entire underground empire. Now they were holding a thin piece of crayon paper, as if it was the most fragile and precious object he had ever touched. "Thank you," he said, and his voice broke completely on those two words. "It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." On the drive back in the black Audi, the drawing sat on Jude's lap. He was completely silent for a full 5 minutes. Lena did not speak either, giving him the quiet space she knew he needed. Then Jude finally spoke, his voice low and firm. It was no longer broken, but seemed to be forged from something new, something stronger than steel and deeper than regret. "I've lost 4 years," he said, his eyes fixed on the road in front of them. "I will not lose another day." Jude was true to his word. He came back the very next day, and the day after that, and every day that followed. An entire month went by, and Jude Kensington did not miss a single visit. He never arrived a minute late, even if it meant leaving a board meeting in the middle, postponing a call with partners in London, or fighting through Boston's rush-hour traffic just to get to the Dorchester apartment at 4 o'clock, exactly as he had promised. At first, Phoebe still called him Uncle Jude. She always kept a careful arm's length of distance between them, with her stuffed animal, Biscuit, wedged in the space like a little shield. But children have their own methods for measuring a person's sincerity, and their tools are far more accurate than anything adults could ever invent. Phoebe measured Jude with his patience. She saw it in the way he never tried to make her talk when she wanted to be quiet, and how he always sat on the floor instead of a chair so they could be at eye level. She noticed how he remembered that she liked purple crayons more than blue ones, and that Biscuit needed his own special seat whenever it was time for cookies. Slowly, that arm's length of distance got smaller. The worn-out stuffed animal went from being a barrier to a shared friend. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Jude was sitting cross-legged on the old rug of the Dorchester apartment, wearing a $3,000 suit and having a tea party with Phoebe and her plastic toy tea set. The silent guest of honored guest at his seat, with a little pink plastic cup set in front of him. Phoebe poured imaginary tea into Jude's cup with the serious focus of a proper host. "Here is your tea," she announced. "No sugar, because you said you do not like sugar." Jude took a sip from the pink plastic cup with the same serious look he had when he signed contracts in front of a boardroom full of directors. "It is excellent," he declared. "You make better tea than Brennan." Phoebe giggled, her dimples showing deep and bright, while Lena stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her coffee mug and biting her lip to stop the wave of emotion rising inside her. And then that day finally arrived. It was not a special day at all. It was just a normal Saturday afternoon. Jude had taken Phoebe and Lena to the grocery store because Phoebe was determined to get a chocolate cereal that Mama never bought her because it was too expensive. They were walking down the aisle, with Phoebe sitting in the shopping cart, her legs swinging back and forth, her eyes scanning all the colorful boxes on the shelves. She finally saw it high up on the top shelf, the cereal box with the cartoon rabbit she loved, placed just out of her reach and out of Lena's. Without a second thought, without any hesitation at all, Phoebe turned to the man standing closest to her and said, "Daddy, can you get that for me?" Jude stopped cold in the middle of the aisle. His hand was already in the air, his fingertips just about to touch the box, and he stayed frozen in that position like a statue. His eyes welled up with tears almost instantly. It happened so fast that Lena knew he had no time to prepare himself, to put up his defenses, or to wear his tough guy mask. He was just a man standing in a busy supermarket, holding a cereal box with a cartoon rabbit on it, with his eyes glistening. The word "daddy" seemed to ring in his ears, a sound he never knew he had been waiting his entire life to hear. "Daddy," Phoebe said again, confused about why he had stopped moving. I want that one. Jude swallowed hard, blinked a few times, and then placed the cereal box into the shopping cart. Here you are, princess, he managed to say. His voice was a little shaky, but his smile was the biggest and brightest Lena had ever seen on his face. Back at the mansion on Beacon Hill, Catherine Kensington was also beginning to change. Every weekend, Phoebe would visit the estate, and the strict matriarch who had helped run a hidden empire alongside, who had been her husband for 40 years, was sitting on the living room floor, playing with dolls alongside her granddaughter. Catherine taught Phoebe how to mold clay and told her stories about Jude as a little boy. For the first time in ages, the sound of a child's laughter filled rooms that had only known the heavy silence of power and secrets. Brennan was the first one to notice the change. One evening, as Jude was leaving the Dorchester apartment after reading Phoebe a bedtime story, Brennan was waiting by the car. He watched his boss approach with a smile still lingering on his face. "You're a different man, boss," Brennan remarked. Jude glanced at him. "The way you smile," Brennan explained, his tone less like an accusation and more like pure astonishment. "I have worked for you for 10 years. I have never seen you smile like that." Jude offered no reply, but he knew Brennan was right. He started to turn down certain meetings, the kind that never appeared on official calendars, the ones held in the basements of restaurants or the back rooms of clubs, the kind he used to never miss. He began to delegate his responsibilities, one by one, like a man carefully taking apart a tower he had spent 15 years building, starting from the very top, slowly but surely. And on the refrigerator in the Dorchester apartment, in the most prominent spot, was Phoebe's latest drawing, held up by a flower-shaped magnet. It showed 3 figures holding hands. Mama was on the left, Phoebe was in the middle, and then there was Daddy. For the first time, he was not off in a distant corner, no longer just a faint outline sketched at the edge of the paper. This time, Daddy stood right beside them, holding his daughter's hand and holding Mama's hand. He was drawn large, clear, and present, colored in with the darkest black crayon in the entire box. It was as if Phoebe wanted to be absolutely certain that this time, Daddy would not disappear. The picnic was Jude's idea. He brought it up on a Friday night while the 3 of them were sitting on the floor of the Dorchester apartment, eating pizza because the table was too small for 3 people. Phoebe announced it was the best pizza party of her entire life, even though it was just a $12 pizza from the shop on the corner. "The weather is going to be beautiful tomorrow," Jude said, looking over at Lena. "We could go to Walden Pond, the 3 of us. If you agree?" Lena paused for a moment. It would be the first time they had ever gone out together as a family. Not in the familiar safety of the apartment, and not within the protected walls of the mansion, but out in the real world, where anyone might see them and think they were just an ordinary family. "All right," she said. On Saturday morning, the black Audi left Boston and headed west. Phoebe was strapped into the car seat Jude had purchased the week before, a biscuit in her lap, talking a mile a minute. She told them all about a boy at her preschool named Tommy who had lost his front tooth. She talked about how Miss Teresa was teaching her to paint butterflies using her fingers. And she explained how her doll, Dolly, was knitting a wool hat for her stuffed bear, Biscuit, because winter was coming and bears get cold, too. Daddy Jude drove the car, glancing in the rearview mirror to watch his daughter. He answered every single one of her questions, nodded when he was supposed to, and acted surprised when the story called for it. Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching the 2 of them in that same mirror, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that she was afraid to give a name to. Then, right in the middle of the butterfly story, Phoebe suddenly asked, as casually as if she were talking about the weather, "Daddy, why weren't you with Mama from the start?" A heavy silence immediately filled the car. Lena felt like she could not breathe. Her fingers tightened on the edge of her seat. In the mirror, she could see Jude's hands grip the steering wheel. His jaw was clenched, but he did not avoid the question. He did not change the subject. He did not say, You will understand when you are older, like so many other adults would. Because Daddy did something very, very wrong, Jude said, speaking slowly and carefully, like a man testing thin ice. Daddy thought that going away would keep Mama safe, but all it did was make Mama sad, and it meant Daddy lost a lot of time with you. Phoebe was quiet for a moment, thinking it over in the unique way that only a 4-year-old can. Then she said, "But Daddy's here now." "Yes," Jude replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy's here now. And Daddy is not going away again." "Right, never, Pinky promise." Jude looked into the rearview mirror. Phoebe had her tiny little finger raised with great seriousness. As if it were the most sacred promise in the world, he reached back with his right hand and hooked his pinky around hers. His larger, rougher finger completely enveloped her small one with a gentleness that only a father can show his child. "Pinky promise," Jude said. Walden Pond on an autumn morning was so beautiful it looked like a painting. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the blue sky and the trees that were changing from green to gold and fiery red. The air was crisp and fresh, filled with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. They spread Dolly's patchwork blanket under a large oak tree near the water and set out the food Jude had picked up from a deli on the way. There were sandwiches, fruit, juice, and a box of cookies that Phoebe insisted they bring because these are the ones Grandma Catherine gives me. They are the best ones. After they ate, Phoebe got out the watercolor set Jude had bought her the week before and sat at the edge of the blanket, painting a picture of the lake. She worked with intense focus, her head bowed and her tongue sticking out just a little in concentration. The two adults leaned against the trunk of the oak tree, their shoulders close but not quite touching, as they watched her. "Lena," Jude said, and his voice had changed. It was no longer a daddy talking to his little girl, but a man speaking to the woman he loved, his voice low and trembling slightly. "I want a second chance." Lena did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Phoebe, who was mixing blue and white paint to get the color of the water just right. "Not just because of Phoebe," Jude went on, "though she is the most important reason, but because of us. Because what we had, it never really went away." He paused for a moment, then added more quietly, almost to himself. 5 years, Lena. 5 years. I kept the coaster with your name on it in my jacket pocket. I carried it from Boston to London and put it on my nightstand every single night. Brennan thinks I am crazy. He managed a sad half-smile. Maybe I am, but I met a lot of people in those 5 years, and not a single one of them was you. Lena finally turned to face him. His gray-blue eyes met hers with complete and total honesty. There was no mafia armor, no protective walls. It was just the man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago, sitting under an oak tree by a lake, asking for another chance. "I am scared," she admitted, more honest than she had ever been before. "I am scared of your world, Jude. It is dangerous. It took you away from me once. It could get you again. Or even worse, it could get to Phoebe." Jude offered no arguments, no grand promises, and no empty words of comfort. He simply told her, "Do not believe what I say. Watch what I do. I will prove it to you every single day." Before Lena could even respond, Phoebe came running up to them, her painting still a little wet, her eyes bright with excitement. "Look," she exclaimed, holding it up for them to see. There was a blue lake and trees painted in red and gold. In the very middle, 3 figures stood together right at the edge of the water. This was not like her old drawing, where 3 people held hands while a fourth, her daddy, was far off in the corner. This time, all 3 were shoulder to shoulder. Above them, in the clumsy letters Phoebe had just learned to make, was a single word: family. Lena gazed at the painting, then at Phoebe, and finally at Jude. She slowly and gently placed her hand on top of his with a newfound certainty. It was the first time in 5 years she had reached out to him. "One step at a time," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. But we do it together. Jude turned his palm upward and laced his fingers through hers as they sat together under the big oak tree, watching Phoebe chase a butterfly toward the lake. The painting that said family lay between them on the colorful quilt. On the ride back, Phoebe drifted off to sleep in her car seat, her favorite bear, Biscuit, tucked safely under her chin. Her lips were slightly parted, and her breathing was soft and steady. The Audi moved smoothly down the highway as the Boston skyline appeared, colored in the violet and red of twilight. Lena and Jude's hands stayed clasped together over the center console. Neither of them said a word. They did not need to. For the first time in 5 years, the quiet between them was not filled with loss, anger, or loneliness. It was a silence of peace, the kind shared by two people who had finally found their way back to one another. The week following the picnic was so perfect that Lena started to feel a sense of dread. It was not the familiar fear of being poor or alone that she had lived with for so long. This was a fear of happiness itself. She was afraid because every morning Phoebe would race to the door the moment the bell rang, yelling, "Daddy!" and throwing herself at Jude's legs like a tiny rocket. Her smile was enormous. Lena knew that if that smile ever disappeared, it would shatter Phoebe in a way that 4 years without a father never could have. This time, she would understand exactly what she was losing. Lena was afraid because every morning she made coffee for Jude, black with no sugar, and placed it on the little kitchen table. He would take a sip and look at her with those same gray-blue eyes that had captivated her 5 years ago, and she could feel herself falling for him all over again. She was afraid because Catherine Kensington, the formidable matriarch, invited all 3 of them for dinner in the main dining hall of the Beacon Hill mansion. They were not hidden away in the guest house or a private room, but seated at the main table where every significant Kensington family dinner had taken place for 50 years. Catherine had even bought a special high chair for Phoebe, and Biscuit sat in the chair right next to her because Phoebe insisted the bear needed his own spot. Catherine did not raise a single protest. It was an act of acceptance more powerful than any formal announcement could have been. Everything was perfect, and Lena was terrified because life had taught her that beautiful things never last. Then she noticed the SUV. She first saw it on Tuesday while picking up Phoebe from her preschool. It was a black SUV with dark tinted windows, parked across the road about 30 meters from the school gate. At first, Lena did not think much of it. Boston was filled with black SUVs. But when she returned on Thursday, the exact same vehicle was there again. It was in the same spot with the same license plate. This time, the driver rolled the window down just a crack, enough for Lena to see a man's face staring directly at the preschool gate where Phoebe was running out, hugging her plush toy. Lena squeezed her daughter's hand tighter and began walking much faster, her heart racing. She told herself she was probably overreacting, that it was likely just another parent waiting. But the survival instincts she had developed over 27 years of fending for herself were screaming that something was terribly wrong. That evening, Dolly knocked on her apartment door. The warm smile Lena was used to seeing on her 68-year-old neighbor's face was gone, replaced by a look of deep concern. "Someone was asking questions today," Dolly said in a low voice. "While you were gone, a man in a suit with perfectly combed hair came by. He was very polite, but it was the fake kind of polite. He wanted to know where the little girl went to school, what time you picked her up, and if anyone else ever came to get her." The color drained from Lena's face. "What did you say to him?" "I told him I had no idea," Dolly answered, her eyes sharp. "I have been around long enough to know when you should not answer a stranger's questions." Lena locked the door and then checked it a second time. She peeked into the bedroom where Phoebe was asleep with Biscuit before she took out her phone and dialed Jude. He was there in less than 15 minutes. But the man who walked into her Dorchester apartment that night was not Daddy Jude. He was not the man who would sit on the floor and drink imaginary tea from a tiny pink cup. This man was entirely different. His face was like stone, his jaw was set, and his gray-blue eyes were as hard as tempered steel. This was Jude Kensington, the boss. This was the man the entire East Coast knew better than to cross. He listened intently as Lena explained every detail. The SUV, the man who had questioned Dolly. Then, he made a single phone call to a man named Brennan. Check this out. A black SUV with tinted windows near the preschool on Adams. I am sending you the plate number. Find out who is asking questions about my daughter. His voice was not soft, but every word sent a chill through Lena. It was not a fear of him, but a fear of the world he was a part of. A world that was now reaching its grimy hands toward her child. The answer arrived before midnight. Brennan called back, his voice tight with tension. It is Vincent Corsetti's men, he said. A rival from New York trying to squeeze Jude on territory. They had found out Jude had a daughter and a former girlfriend. They saw a weakness, a point of leverage. A 4-year-old girl and an orphan from Dorchester with no one to protect her. They were the perfect targets. Lena listened as Jude talked to Brennan on the phone. She did not understand all the words they used, but she understood enough to know that her daughter had just become a pawn in a game between mob bosses. And a rage, stronger than any fear she had ever felt, began to build inside her. This, Lena said, her voice shaking not with fear, but with fury, after Jude hung up and turned to face her. This is why I am scared. This is exactly what I told you at the lake. Your world is dangerous, and you have dragged us right into it. Lena, Phoebe is 4 years old, she whispered fiercely, mindful of her daughter sleeping in the next room, but her voice was as sharp as a knife. 4 years old, Jude, and now someone is watching her, asking questions about her, knowing where she goes to school and what time I pick her up. All because of you. Because of the name Kensington, because of the empire you have built. She took a step back, and that single step created more distance than miles ever could. My daughter will not be a hostage in your war, Jude Kensington. I have spent my whole life on my own, and I can do it again. I will take Phoebe and leave Boston if I have to. I have been running my entire life. I know how to run. Jude did not say, I will take care of it, or trust me, or any of the other empty promises Lena had heard from too many people. He just looked at her, his gray-blue eyes turning cold and hard as steel, gave a single nod, and walked out of the apartment. The door clicked shut behind him, and Lena stood alone in the living room, her hand pressed against her chest, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the old staircase. She had no idea that in the next 12 hours, Jude Kensington was going to tear down everything he had spent the last 15 years building. The first call he made was the moment he got into his car. He did not call Brennan, he called Vincent Corsetti directly. Brennan, who was driving, stared at Jude as if he had gone completely insane when he heard him speak into the phone. His voice was so calm, it was frightening. Vincent, this is Jude Kensington. That South Boston territory deal you wanted, I am giving it to you, the whole thing. There is only one condition. My family is off limits. From this point forward, if any of your men come anywhere near my daughter or her mother again, this will no longer be a negotiation. It will be a war, and you know I do not bluff. Corsetti accepted the deal. Of course he did. The South Boston deal was worth tens of millions of dollars, and he had just won it without lifting a finger. But Jude was not finished. His second call was to Daniel Whitfield, a corporate lawyer. He was not a mob attorney who knew how to hide crimes in legal documents, but the kind who wore crisp white shirts and worked in glass offices downtown, handling legitimate business transfers. Daniel, I need to see you right now, tonight. I want to sign the papers to transfer all unofficial operations of Kensington Holdings to the subordinate executive council. All of it. I am stepping away completely. The silence on the other end of the line was so long that Jude knew Daniel was struggling to understand if he had heard him correctly. Are you certain? We are talking about the entire network. All of it, Jude confirmed. Brennan drove him to the law firm. He remained silent the entire way. But as Jude opened the car door to get out, Brennan finally said something. "Boss, that is 15 years of your life. That is the empire you led, the one you built with your own two hands, even while living under the heavy shadow of your father's expectations." Jude stopped, with one foot on the pavement, and glanced back over his shoulder. "Everything I built," he said, his voice quiet but filled with absolute conviction, "is sleeping in an apartment in Dorchester, hugging a stuffed bear named Biscuit." Brennan stared at him for a long moment and then simply nodded, saying nothing more. 3 hours later, Jude had signed everything away. Every document, every transfer, every single agreement. When he walked out of that law office at 2 in the morning, he was a completely different man. No longer the most powerful mob boss on the East Coast. He was simply Jude Kensington, a 36-year-old man who owned a legitimate real estate and casino company, and the father of a 4-year-old girl whose first 4 years of life he had missed. But he did not go straight to Lena's apartment. He went back to the mansion, walked into his private study, opened a desk drawer, and pulled out a rolled-up tube he had been hiding there for weeks. He had it before the picnic, before he had even allowed himself to hope. They were architectural drawings, the first project he had designed himself since giving up his dream of becoming an architect 15 years ago. At 3 in the morning, Jude stood outside apartment 312 in the Maple Building in Dorchester. He had dark circles under his eyes. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and his hair was a mess from running his hands through it all night. In one hand, he held the legal transfer papers. In the other, he held the roll of blueprints. He knocked softly on the door. Lena opened it, her eyes dark from a sleepless night. She was still in the clothes she had been wearing during the day. It was clear she had been waiting up or trying to figure out there was nowhere left to run. Her eyes locked with his. Jude placed a thick stack of papers on the kitchen table. "They are transfer documents," he stated. "I have already signed them. All of my underground business has been moved to the subordinate council. I am completely finished with that life. Kensington Holdings is now a legitimate company. We will focus on real estate, casinos, and investments. Everything is clean." Lena glanced at the papers, but did not touch them. She looked back at him, her expression still cautious. But beneath her caution, another feeling was fighting its way to the surface. It was something that felt like hope. Jude unrolled a set of blueprints, spreading the large sheet across the small kitchen table. He used a coffee mug and a salt shaker to hold down the edges because the table was too narrow. Under the flickering fluorescent light, a design came into view. The lines were clean, precise, and beautiful, showing professional skill but drawn with immense passion. It was a brownstone in Brookline, with 2 stories and a red brick exterior. Inside, the first floor had a studio with large, north-facing windows, providing the kind of light that graphic designers dream about. On the second floor, there was a child's art room with white walls for displaying drawings and a small easel positioned next to the window. The backyard featured a young oak tree and a swing. "This is my first real project," Jude said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. "I wanted to be an architect before my father pushed me into something else. This is the dream I buried a long time ago. Now, I am bringing it back to life." He pointed to each room on the plan. "A studio for you. It has northern light, exactly what you need for your design work. An art room for Phoebe. The walls are white so she can cover them with her artwork. A backyard with a swing, because last week she asked why our house does not have one." "Jude, you cannot buy my love with a house." He spoke quickly, worried she might misunderstand. "This is a promise. It is a promise that I am willing to rebuild everything from the start. A clean life, with no shadows, no criminal world, just me, you, and Phoebe." Lena studied the drawing. Her fingers traced the outline of the studio, where he had even sketched in the desk and the wide window. Then her hand moved to the small art room where he had placed Phoebe's easel in the perfect spot to capture the light. Her hand trembled. "Do you know what I am most afraid of?" she whispered. "It is not being poor. I have been poor my whole life, and I got through it. It is not being alone. I have been alone for my entire life, and I am still here. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening, but not crying. What I am most terrified of is not belonging anywhere. All my life, I moved from one foster home to another, from one rented room to the next. I have never had a place that felt like home. No one has ever said you belong here and truly meant it. Jude took a slow, gentle step closer, just like he had when he first met Phoebe, giving her space to move away if she wanted. She did not move. You belong here, he said, his voice deep and steady, yet trembling slightly. Both of you belong here. Lena looked at him, at his gray-blue eyes darkened by a sleepless night. She saw his wrinkled suit from the long hours spent in a law office, signing away his empire. She saw the blueprint of a house, a dream he had buried for 15 years. Then, she stepped forward and put her hand on his chest, right over the inside pocket where the coaster with her name had been for 5 years. She felt his heart pounding against her palm. He was a mafia boss, an architect, the father of her daughter, and the man who had given up an empire for a 4-year-old child and the woman he never stopped loving. The first kiss in 5 years was so light, it was almost not there. It was just breath meeting breath, lips brushing against lips, hesitant and trembling, as if they were seeing if something broken could be whole again. Then the kiss became deeper, more confident, and stronger. 5 years of loneliness, 5 years of anger, and 5 years of love hidden behind defensive walls all melted away in that small kitchen. It happened under a flickering fluorescent light, between the transfer papers and the blueprint for a dream house. When they pulled away, both of them had wet eyes. "This is a yes, is it not?" Jude whispered. Lena smiled, her first real smile without any barriers. No armor, no walls, just Lena. "This is a, let's build it together," she said. The brownstone in Brookline was finished on a late autumn morning as the last leaves on the maple trees were changing from a brilliant red to a polished copper. The red brick exterior glowed warmly in the soft sunlight. The large windows reflected a clear blue sky. In the backyard, the young oak tree held on to its last few yellow leaves, as if it wanted to welcome the new family with its most beautiful colors before winter began. Phoebe was the first one to walk through the door. She stood in the entryway, with her stuffed bear Biscuit held tightly under her arm. Her eyes, which were a perfect reflection of his, were so wide they seemed to fill her whole face. And then she let out a cry of pure joy, a sound that only a child can make, a sound unfiltered by any defenses. "My room, Mama, Daddy, where is my room?" Jude led her upstairs. When he opened the door to the art room, Phoebe stopped still. It had white walls. A small easel was set by the window to catch the morning light. A new box of crayons and a watercolor set were neatly placed on a shelf. And in the corner was a small wooden bed, which Jude had built himself, that was just the right size for a stuffed bear. Phoebe looked at the bed, then at Biscuit, then up at her daddy with shining eyes. She gently laid Biscuit on the new bed and pulled the tiny blanket right up to the bear's chin. Then she looked at Jude with the most serious face a 4-year-old could make and declared, "Biscuit has his own room now." Jude knelt down to give her a hug, while Lena leaned against the doorway, watching them. Her hand clutched the wooden frame because her knees suddenly felt weak. It wasn't from sadness, but from a heart so full it felt bigger than it had in her entire 27 years. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. Catherine Kensington was standing on their porch, looking as flawless as ever in a chic, light gray suit with her platinum hair perfectly styled. But she was holding something Lena never would have expected. It was a heavy, antique silver picture frame with intricate carvings, clearly a family heirloom, not something from a store. And inside that frame was the photo Catherine had commissioned just last week at her mansion. It showed Phoebe in a green velvet armchair, with Biscuit on her lap, smiling so wide you could see her dimple. It was the very first official portrait of a Kensington granddaughter. Catherine offered the frame to Lena. As Lena took it, Catherine placed a hand on her shoulder. She said nothing, because she did not have to. The gentle weight of her hand was firm enough to be reassuring, yet light enough to respect the careful new boundaries they had built over the past few weeks. It was a gesture more powerful than any formal words of acceptance could ever be. Catherine came inside and spent an hour with Phoebe in the art room. She showed her how to mix blue and white paint to create clouds, sharing that Jude had loved painting clouds when he was a boy. He used to say that clouds were the one thing in the world nobody could ever truly own. When it was time for Catherine to leave, she did not use the front door. She walked through the backyard, stopping for a moment under a young oak tree to look back at the house. The second-floor window was glowing with light, and she could see Phoebe's little shadow dancing behind the curtain as her laughter drifted into the crisp autumn air. Catherine stood there for a long time, all alone, the powerful matriarch's face softened by the warm light from the window. And for the first time in many, many years, she smiled. It was a private smile, meant for no one else to see. The kind of smile that comes from knowing you have finally done something right after years of watching things go so wrong. Then she turned and walked away, her steps feeling light on the stone path that led to the back gate. She was stepping out of a picture that she knew was finally complete without her in it. That night, after Phoebe had her bath and changed into the star-patterned pajamas Catherine had bought for her, Jude carried her to her new bed. Phoebe snuggled under the covers, grabbed Biscuit from his little nightstand to sleep beside her, and looked up at her father. "Daddy, this is our house, right?" she asked. "Yes, Princess. This is our house forever." "Forever," she repeated with a happy little smile, her dimple making an appearance. Her heavy, silver-blue eyelids slowly drifted closed, and soon her breathing grew soft and even. She was sound asleep, the deep, peaceful sleep of a child who finally had her own room, a daddy, a mama, and a home. Jude watched her for a long time before he went downstairs. He carefully took the painting Phoebe had made at Walden Pond out of its protective tube. It showed 3 figures holding hands by a lake, with the word family written above them. He hung it on the living room wall, in the most important spot where it would be the first thing anyone saw when they walked in. Right next to it, he placed a small glass frame. Inside was the old, worn coaster from Rosie's Cafe. Its edges were soft, the Rose logo was faded, and on the back, written in slanted blue ink, was the name Lena. After 5 years tucked away in his suit pocket, after thousands of nights on a bedside table in London, after tens of thousands of times he had traced the letters of her name in the dark, the coaster had finally found its home. It was no longer a painful reminder of what he had lost, but the first page of their new story. Lena was standing at the window in her first-floor art studio, a room Jude had designed just for her. The large, north-facing window let the moonlight pour in, creating a silver path across the new wooden floor. She stood there, her hand resting on the cool glass, looking out at the backyard where the swing set moved gently in the night air. Jude came up softly behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on the top of her head. They stood there together in the moonlight, just listening to the wind and to the quiet creaks of the new house as it settled, almost as if it were breathing. Through the baby monitor Jude had set up on the very first day, they could hear the steady, peaceful sound of Phoebe sleeping upstairs. "We lost 5 years," Lena whispered into the quiet. Jude held her just a little tighter. "We have a lifetime ahead of us," he replied. And that is where our story ends, in a brownstone in Brooklyn, where a coaster with Lena's name on it sits in a frame next to a crayon drawing of a family. It is a home where a stuffed bear named Biscuit has his own bed, and where a man who once ran an empire was willing to burn it all down just to build a house with a swing set for his daughter. and it is where a 27-year-old orphan finally found the place where she belongs. Sometimes life takes so much from us. It can take away our time, our opportunities, and the people we hold dearest. But sometimes, if we are brave enough to open our hearts one more time, strong enough to forgive, and patient enough to trust in actions more than words, a miracle can happen. It might arrive late, but it is never too late. If this story touched you, please show your support by liking this video so we can continue to share more stories just like this one. Share it with the people you care about, or with anyone who needs a reminder that no matter how difficult life gets, love and honesty will always find their way home. And do not forget to subscribe so you never miss our new, touching stories that we post every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever lost someone, only to find them again? Or maybe you are on a journey like Lena, still searching for that place where you truly belong. Please share your thoughts with us in the comments section below. We read every single comment, and we want to know what is in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, happiness, and peace in your daily lives. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.